Those guest passes are community privilege, Mr. Vance, not a property right. And as of this morning, your allotment has been revoked pending review. That was Diane Pruitt, president of the Stillwater Ridge Homeowners Association, for 9 years running, reading me a line off a clipboard while a sheriff's deputy stood on my own graveled drive with his thumbs hooked in his belt, unsure why he was even there. The property she was talking about was 40 acres of high desert and one timber lodge I had spent the better part of my life paying down, and the guest passes she had just frozen were the only way my late wife's family could still drive up the access road to see the place where her ashes were scattered. What Diane did not know, what she never once thought to check in 9 years of running that board like a small kingdom, was that the access road, the gatehouse, and the resort her association leased every autumn for its leadership retreats all sat on parcels I had been quietly buying since the year my wife got sick. So when she revoked my passes to punish me, she handed me the lever that would end her. What would you have done? Standing on your own land, holding a coffee mug, watching a woman in a linen blazer tell you that your dead wife's sister needed her permission to drive up a road I owned. My name is Ray Calloway. I am 61 years old, and for 34 of those years I was a civil engineer who specialized in water and access infrastructure for ski resorts and mountain developments across 3 states. I designed the culverts. I sized the easements, I stamped the road grades, and I sat in enough planning hearings to learn that the people who win property fights are never the ones who shout the loudest. They are the ones who kept the paper. A man can be right and still lose if he cannot lay the proof on a table. A man can be quiet and still win if he can. I learned that young, watching a developer lose a 100-acre project because he never recorded a single easement, and I never forgot it. I came to Stillwater Ridge in my early 40s with my wife Carol and our daughter, and we bought the lodge before the subdivision below us was anything but a survey stake in a banker's daydream. The 40 acres had belonged to a cattle outfit that went under in the 80s, and the abstract that came with the deed was 2 inches thick, going back to territorial days. Most buyers would have skimmed it and filed it. I read every page because reading every page was my trade, and the things I found in it I tucked away in the back of my mind without knowing I would ever need them. The deed carried rights that nobody in the new development ever bothered to read. Carol used to say, the lodge had good bones and a stubborn owner, and she meant both of us. She would stand on the porch in the morning with her coffee and watch the light come down the ridge and tell me she had married a man who loved a road grade more than was strictly healthy. She was not wrong. We raised our daughter up there in the summers, and Carol planted a grove of aspens on the slope above the spring, a dozen saplings she babied through 3 dry years until they took. By the time the trouble started, those aspens were 30 feet tall and turned the whole hillside gold in October. That grove matters. Hold on to it. I want to tell you the rest of it in order, because the order is the whole point. People think a fight like this gets won in one loud afternoon. It does not. It gets won in a manila folder. You start years before you know you will need it. When Carol was diagnosed, the doctors gave her a span measured in months, and they were close to right. I made 2 promises in the parking lot of that clinic, leaning on the truck while she rested inside. The first was to her, that she would spend her last good months up at the lodge with the aspens turning, and not in a town apartment near the clinic with a view of a parking structure. I kept that one. We moved a hospital bed into the front room where she could see the grove, and her sister Lena drove up every few weeks. And our daughter came home, and Carol watched her trees go gold one last October, and told me it was enough. She died in November. We carried her ashes up to the grove she had planted, and we let her go into the roots of it, and that is why the road, up the ridge is not a convenience to me. It is the only way to the only place she is. The second promise was to myself, standing in that parking lot, that I would never again let anyone with a title and no facts decide what happened on the land she loved. I had spent my whole career watching men in good suits make claims they had never verified, and I had watched the quiet ones with the recorded paper take everything from them in a single afternoon. I told myself I would be the quiet one. That second promise took longer to keep, and it cost me 3 years and a great deal of patience, and I am going to tell you exactly how I kept it. Stillwater Ridge Estates was built in the valley below my 40 acres, a gated development of about 90 homes that marketed itself on alpine views and exclusivity. The developer who platted it ran out of money halfway through, and the unsold pieces, including a lodge and cabin compound a mile up the ridge from me that he had hoped to flip into a private resort, went onto the county tax rolls and sat there. The Homeowners Association formed to run the gate, the roads, and the amenities. And somewhere in those early years, Diane Pruitt got herself elected president. And never let go. I met her the first spring after Carol passed. She drove a white luxury SUV with a vanity plate that read Rye R.I. Deej 1, and she came up my road in it wearing kitten heels that were no match for my gravel. I watched her pick her way across the drive from the porch where I was splitting kindling, and I knew before she opened her mouth what kind of conversation it would be. She had a clipboard then too, and a folder with the association seal printed on the cover, and a smile she had practiced. She introduced herself as Diane Pruitt, president of the Stillwater Ridge Homeowners Association, and she said it the way other people say, doctor or senator. She told me my lodge was, in her words, functionally part of the Stillwater Ridge community, and that as a courtesy, she would be adding me to the association roster and the dues schedule. She handed me a welcome packet. There was a fee schedule in it, and an architectural standards manual, and a form consenting to the covenant. Already filled in with my name, I set down the hatchet. I told her politely that my parcel predated her subdivision by 40 years, that it sat a mile outside her recorded plat, that I had never signed a covenant and never would, and that she was welcome to verify all of it at the county recorder's office for the price of a copy fee. I told her my road and my lodge were my own. She did not write any of that down. She smiled the way people smile when they have already decided you are wrong, and she said the board would look into my community status, and she said it like a kindness she was doing me. Then she picked her way back to the SUV and drove off down my road, kicking up dust she clearly resented. That was escalation number 1. I went inside, took a manila folder from the drawer where Carol kept the household papers, and on the tab I wrote the date and one word: Pruitt. Then I made coffee and sat at her kitchen table, which I still called her kitchen table. And I thought about the abstract 2 inches thick in the safe, and I did not yet know which page would matter. I only knew the habit. When someone with a title makes a claim, you start a folder. The second escalation came that fall. A letter on association letterhead informed me that, pending the board's review of my community status, I would be permitted 12 guest passes per year for the gate, and that any guest beyond that allotment would be turned away at the gatehouse. Now understand what that meant. The only paved way up to my lodge ran through the Stillwater Gate, because the developer had built the gatehouse across the historic county road, and the association had been operating it for years as if it were theirs. Carol's sister Lena and her kids drove up 3 or 4 times a year to sit by the aspens. My daughter came home from college on breaks. 12 passes was not a courtesy, it was a leash. I wrote the date on a fresh page. I did not call Diane. I did not shout at the gate. I called the title company in the county seat, a place I had used a dozen times in my working years, and I asked a woman named Sheila, who had pulled records for me before, to run a full chain of title on my 40 acres and on every unsold parcel the failed developer had left on the tax rolls. She asked if I was buying. I told her I was reading. She laughed and said I was the only client she had who ordered title work for the pleasure of it. It cost me a few $100s and 3 weeks of waiting, and when the envelope came, I sat at Carol's kitchen table under the good lamp, and I read it twice, slowly, the way I used to read a survey before I stamped it. The historic county road, the one the Stillwater Gatehouse straddled, carried a recorded public access easement dating to 1911, granted when the original cattle outfit deeded a right-of-way to the county, so the mail and the stock. It had never been vacated. It was still public, still recorded, still binding on every parcel it crossed. The association had built its gatehouse squarely on top of a public easement and had spent years charging and restricting access across a road it had no right to control. I read that paragraph a third time to be sure. Then I sat back and listened to the wind come down the ridge, and I thought about Diane Pruitt's clipboard and her practiced smile, and I felt the first thing I had felt since Carol died that was not grief. It was patience with a purpose. That was the first card. I photocopied it, filed the original in the safe, and told no one, not even Mara. There is a thing I learned designing resort infrastructure, and I am going to say it plainly because it is half the lesson of this whole story. The person who controls the water and the road controls the property. No matter whose name is on the fancy house, Diane controlled the gate. I was about to control everything the gate depended on. That winter, I did something that looked, to anyone watching, like a grieving widower making a strange hobby of the county tax auction. The lodge and cabin compound up the ridge, the one the developer had wanted to turn into a private resort, had gone delinquent on its taxes when his money ran out. So had 2 adjoining parcels that held the spring and the storage pond feeding the whole Stillwater water system. I had designed systems exactly like it 100 times in my working life, and I did not have to guess at how this one worked. I drove the parcels in my truck on a cold, clear Sunday, and I found the spring box under a stand of firs, and I traced the gravity line down the slope by the lay of the ground. And I stood at the storage pond and looked down at the rooftops of Stillwater Ridge Estates and understood the whole thing in about 10 minutes. Every house in that gated subdivision drank and bathed and watered its lawn on a gravity feed from a spring on land nobody in the valley actually owned. I went back to Sheila and confirmed it on paper. The previous owner had never recorded a water right protecting the use. Never recorded an easement carrying the line down to the development. Nothing. The association had simply inherited a pipe and assumed the water came with it. It did not. Water in this state goes to the senior recorded right, and the right on that spring traced back to the same 1911 era as my road easement, and it had passed with the land, and the land was about to pass to whoever paid the back taxes. So, I paid them. I set up a small holding company so my name would not flag anything at the gate, and over 2 tax seasons I bought all 3 parcels at the county auction, in the open, bidding against nobody because nobody else understood what they were looking at. The compound, the spring, the storage pond. I paid the delinquent taxes and a modest premium, and I recorded every deed the same week I won it. By the time Diane revoked my guest passes, I owned the resort compound she leased every fall for the association's leadership retreats. I owned the spring that fed her subdivision, and I owned the easement under her gatehouse. She just did not know it yet. Nobody did. I filed the deeds next to the 1911 easement, and I waited the way you wait, for concrete to cure. Because rushing it only cracks it. The escalations kept climbing while I kept buying. Escalation 3 arrived as a stack of fines. 22 of them, over 14 months, for offenses like an unapproved exterior paint color on a lodge she had no authority over, for a woodpile she called a fire hazard, for guests who exceeded my 12-pass allotment. The fines totaled a little over $11,000. I paid none of them. I photographed each notice, logged the date and the claimed violation, and filed it. The folder became a binder. The binder got a second volume. Escalation 4 was the inspector. On a Tuesday morning in May, a man in a polo shirt, with a laminated badge clipped to his belt, came up my road in a golf cart. Of all things, a golf cart on a gravel grade a mile up a ridge, and announced he was conducting a compliance walkthrough of my structures on behalf of the association. He had a clipboard and a camera, and a great deal of confidence. His name, he said, was Todd, and he was the association's standards coordinator. I asked to see his county code certification. He told me the association had its own standards, higher than the county's. He wanted me to know. I asked him to show me the document that gave a private association authority to inspect a structure a mile outside its plat. He tapped his badge. I told him the badge was laminated cardstock, and the authority behind it did not exist, that he was standing on private property I held by recorded deed, and that he could leave the way he came. He started to photograph my woodpile anyway. I told him, level and quiet, that every step he took was being recorded, and I pointed up at the camera on the eave of the lodge. He looked at it. He looked at me. Then he got back in his golf cart and went down the road a good deal faster than he had come up it. I had installed those cameras the winter Carol got sick, 4 of them, covering the drive and the gate and the lodge approach, saving to a drive in the lodge and a second drive in a fireproof box in the safe. Todd's entire visit was on both. I logged the date, the time, the claimed authority, the laminated badge, and I clipped a still frame to the page. Escalation 4. The binder was getting heavy enough now that I kept it on the kitchen table instead of the drawer. And Mara started calling it the Pruitt book. My daughter was home that summer between her sophomore and junior years, studying environmental policy of all things. And she was the one who noticed the pattern before I said anything to her about the parcels. She was 19 that year, sharp as her mother and twice as direct, and she sat at the kitchen table one night with the binder open between us, turning pages under the good lamp, and she stopped on the stack of fines and looked up at me. "Dad," she said, "this woman is building a case against you, and you are just letting her. You pay nothing, you say nothing, you file everything. She thinks you are weak." I told her I was not letting Diane build a case against me. I was letting Diane build a case against herself. Mara did not entirely believe me. She was 19, and she wanted to fight, the way you do at 19, and watching me file paper instead of swinging back looked like surrender to her. Still, she trusted me enough to help. And she was better with a spreadsheet than I ever was. She built a tracker that logged every fine by date and claimed violation, every guest turned away at the gate with the name and the day, every notice with a scanned image attached. She color-coded the ones that contradicted each other. And there were several, because Diane never checked her own prior claims any more than she checked the county records. Mara was at the lodge for the setup of all of it. She was there for the worst of it too, and I need you to remember her, because a story like this is never only about land. It is about who is standing next to you when the woman at the gate stops being a nuisance and starts being a danger. That fall, for the first time, I understood the why. I had assumed Diane was simply a small person with a large clipboard, the kind of self-appointed authority that grows in any gated subdivision like algae on a still pond. I was wrong, or at least I was incomplete. Mara was scrolling the county planning portal one evening, looking for Todd, the standards coordinator's non-existent credentials, and she went quiet, and then she turned the laptop around to face me. "Dad," she said, "look at this." It was a rezoning application, filed by a company called Pruitt Vance Development. I want to be careful here, because names matter, and I do not want to mislead you. The Vance in that company name was no relation to me, just a coincidence of common surnames in a small county, which is why Diane kept calling me Mr. Four. Vance, and why I never bothered to correct her, because the mistake amused me, and because a man who is keeping records learns not to interrupt a person who is busy being wrong. The Pruitt, though. The Pruitt was Diane's husband, Gary. The application sought to rezone the failed developer's old resort compound, the very compound I had been quietly buying parcel by parcel at the tax auction, into a luxury wellness resort and event center. 60 rooms. Mara read the narrative section out loud. There was a letter of intent attached from a hospitality group out of state. The deal was contingent, the letter said, on the developer delivering clear title to the compound and secured, documented water service by a closing date the following spring. I sat back from the table, and the whole shape of 3 years rearranged itself in front of me. That was the engine. That was the money. Under all of it, Diane had never been policing my paint and my woodpile for the love of community standards. She had been softening up the one stubborn landowner on the ridge, whose 40 acres and whose road sat between her husband and a multi-million-dollar payday, hoping that enough fines and a frozen pass allotment and a fake inspector and a lawsuit would make me sell cheap or simply give up and move to town. And she had done all of it, every escalation, every notice, without ever once checking whether the compound her husband was rezoning, the water he had promised to deliver, and the road he needed for access were already slipping out of the county's hands at the open tax sale, into the name of a holding company, into mine. She was selling a resort her own family did not own to a buyer who would never close. I called my old colleague, a retired licensed surveyor named Bud Hollis, who had run boundaries for half the resorts I ever designed, and who owed me nothing but came anyway, because that is the kind of man he is. Bud drove up with his total station in the back of his truck and 3 milk crates of old plat books, and he spent 2 days walking my lines, the compound lines, the spring parcels, and the easement under the gatehouse, muttering to himself and writing in a field book with a pencil stub. On the evening of the 2nd day, he sat on my porch, took the beer I handed him, and looked out at the gate lights down the valley for a long minute before he spoke. "Ray," he said, "they are building a resort on water they do not own." He took a pull on the beer. "Turbine by a road they do not control." Another pull. "On a parcel that closed at tax sale 11 months ago." He set the bottle down on the rail and looked at me. "To you?" I told him I knew. He asked me what in the world I was waiting for, why I had not already walked into the county and ended it. I told him I was waiting until they could not back out. As long as the rezoning was just an application, Gary Pruitt could withdraw it, regroup, find another angle, maybe even discover the tax sales and try to unwind them. I needed him committed. I needed money on the table and a closing date on the calendar, and Diane on the record. Bud thought about that, and then he nodded slowly the way an old surveyor nods when a line finally closes. And he said, "You always did read further down the page than the rest of us." He left me a clean signed copy of his survey and the easement plat. Mara would frame that copy later, but I am getting ahead of myself. Escalation 5 was the lawsuit. In December, the association, on Diane's signature, filed a civil suit against me in county court for unpaid fines for what they called continuing trespass of the community standard and for an injunction to compel my compliance with the covenant. The $11,000 in fines had ballooned into a demand for $40,000 plus legal fees and the cost of bringing my lodge, as they put it, into conformity. They served me 3 days before Christmas. A process server in a parka standing on my own porch in the snow while Mara watched through the window with her arms crossed. I took the papers, thanked the man for the cold drive, up and brought them inside. I read the complaint twice at the kitchen table. It was a strange thing to read because it was built, every count of it, on a single assumption that nobody on that board had ever tested. The fines assumed jurisdiction. The trespass count assumed jurisdiction. The injunction assumed jurisdiction. Every dollar they demanded rested on the claim that my lodge sat inside the Stillwater Ridge plat and was bound by its covenant. And that claim was false in the face of the county records, and they had never once checked. They had bet an entire lawsuit with a lawyer's signature on it, on a fact they assumed was true, because Diane had said it often enough. Mara wanted me to countersue that night. I told her no. I filed the complaint in the binder. Escalation 5. Then I called an attorney, a careful woman named Priya in the county seat, not to fight the fines line by line, but to file the narrowest possible answer, denying jurisdiction and reserving everything while I let the real machinery turn at the Planning Commission. Priya read my deeds and my easement and the tax certificates, and she put the phone down for a moment and then said, "Mr. Calloway, you understand they have sued the man who owns their water." I told her I understood it better than anyone. I asked her to keep it quiet a little longer. She did. By February, the rezoning was on the Planning Commission's agenda. Gary Pruitt's hospitality buyers were flying in for a site visit. And here is where I have to tell you about the day the whole thing tipped, because it is the day the story stops being about paint and passes and becomes about the road. My late wife's family could not drive up. It was a Saturday in early March, cold and clear, the kind of high desert morning where you can see 40 miles and the air feels like it could cut you. Lena, Carol's sister, drove up from the city with her 2 kids to leave flowers at the Aspen Grove, the way she did every year near Carol's birthday. She had no passes left. Diane had frozen the allotment to 0 the week before. The morning, the deputy stood on my drive. The gate guard, a kid named Cody, who was just doing his job for $10 an hour, turned her away because his screen told him to. Lena called me from the gatehouse, her voice breaking up over the bad signal. "Ray," she said, "they will not. They will not let us." I drove 3 hours. The phone cut out and came back. "The flowers are wilting in the car, and they will not let us up to Carol's trees." I could hear her youngest, a girl of 6, crying in the back seat, the high, thin crying of a child who does not understand why the grown-ups are upset, only that they are. I told Lena to stay in her car. I told her not to argue with Cody, that none of it was his doing. I told her I was coming down. Then I set my coffee on the rail, and I drove the mile down to the gate with my hands tight on the wheel. Diane was there. The guard had called her, and she had come in the white SUV with the Ridge 1 plate. And she was standing in front of the lowered gate arm in her blazer, with her sunglasses pushed up on her head, And when I got out of my truck, she did not lower her voice. She raised it. She wanted the guard to hear, and Lena to hear, and both children to hear. "These people are not on the approved list, Mr. Vance," she said. "Your guest privileges are suspended pending review. This is association property, and you do not make the rules here. You will learn that this community has standards, and the sooner you accept it, the easier this goes for everyone." I felt my temper come up the way it does, in the hands first and then the jaw, and I want to be honest that part of me wanted to tell her exactly what I owned, and watch her face fall right there on the gravel. I held it down, because I had spent 3 years learning that the loud man loses, that the moment you raise your voice in a fight like this, you hand the other side the only story they need. So I held still. I looked at the little girl's wet face in the back window of Lena's car, and I looked at Diane, and I said only what was true, and nothing more. "The road you are standing on," I told her, "is a public easement recorded in 1911, and you are unlawfully restricting it. I will see you at the Planning Commission on Thursday." That was all. I did not say my name on the deeds. I did not say resort, or spring, or water. I turned and walked to Lena's car and told her quietly that we would take the old fire road across my own land, the back way, and we did. The kids left their flowers in the grove, and the 6-year-old put a rock on top of them so the wind would not take them, and Lena cried a little, and I drove them down the back way at dusk. Diane stood at her gate that whole time, believing she had won again, that she had taught the holdout one more lesson. That was the last step on the staircase before the reveal. I went home, and I did not sleep. At 3 in the morning, I sat in Carol's kitchen with the binder open to a fresh page, and I made the decision I had been circling for 3 years. I would not countersue. I would not stand on the gravel and shout what I owned. I would let Diane Pruitt walk into a public room with her husband's money on the table and commit, on the record, to every single thing she could not defend. And then I would lay down 3 pieces of paper. Thursday, the County Planning Commission met in the annex behind the courthouse, a plain room with folding chairs and a long table for the commissioners and a podium for public comment. Gary Pruitt's rezoning for the wellness resort was the 3rd item on the agenda. His hospitality buyers were in the 2nd row, 2 men in expensive coats taking notes. Diane sat beside her husband at the applicant's table, and when the chairman opened the item, it was Diane who stood and spoke, because Diane could not help but speak. She told the commission the project would bring prosperity to the Ridge. She told them the association had secured access through its gate and water through its system. She told them the only obstacle was an uncooperative neighbor with a non-conforming lodge. And she said my name, and she said the property would be brought into the community one way or another. She characterized me in front of the room as a holdout standing in the way of the public good. She committed, on the record, to every claim her whole scheme depended on. Then the chairman opened the floor to public comment, and I walked to the podium with a single folder. I did not give a speech. I want you to understand that the room expected one, the way rooms always do, when a man walks up holding a folder with a grievance in it, and I did not give it to them. I laid 3 documents on the podium, side by side, and I asked the clerk to enter them into the record. I let the silence sit for a moment while she came around the table for them, and the only sound was the fluorescent hum and a chair creaking somewhere in the back. The first was the recorded deed and the tax sale certificate showing that the resort compound the commission was being asked to rezone had been sold at county tax auction 19 months earlier, and that the current owner of record was a holding company. The second was the recorded title and survey, Bud's Clean Survey, for the 2 parcels holding the spring in the storage pond that fed the entire Stillwater Ridge water system, showing the same holding company as owner and showing no recorded water right or easement of any kind in favor of the association. The third was the 1911 recorded public access easement under the Stillwater Gatehouse. I told the commission plainly and without raising my voice that the applicants did not own the land they sought to rezone, did not control the water they had promised in writing to deliver, and were unlawfully restricting a public road that had been recorded before either of them was born. And then I told them the last thing, and I said it quietly, because quiet was the only way it would land the way it deserved to. I said the holding company that owned all 3 parcels was mine. I had bought the heart of their resort at their own county's open tax sales, on the courthouse steps, in plain daylight, while the association mailed me fines for the color of my paint. The room was very quiet. Diane stood up and said it was impossible, that the compound belonged to the development, and the county clerk, a neutral woman who had pulled these records 100 times, looked at the documents, looked at her own database on the laptop in front of her, and said quietly into the microphone, "The records confirm it." The owner of record is the holding company. There has been no recorded transfer to any development entity. The deed was recorded the previous spring. The tax sale closed clean. I had owned the heart of their resort for 19 months, while Diane revoked my guest passes for the right. To drive up my own road, I will give you the paired numbers because they are the whole shape of it. Against the association, I had paid 0 of the 43 fines they issued, and I had collected through the tax sales they never tracked 3 parcels worth more than the entire development beneath them. Against me, Gary Pruitt had a signed purchase agreement with a hospitality group contingent on a clear title he could not deliver and a closing date 11 days away. 11 days. 43 uncollected fines on my side. 11 days on theirs. The hospitality buyers stood up in the second row, gathered their coats and their notebooks, and walked out before the commissioners had finished speaking, and they did not look back at Gary or Diane on the way to the door. The rezoning was tabled that night, then formally withdrawn within the week, because you cannot rezone land you do not own, and no commission in the country will pretend otherwise. Within a month, the purchase agreement collapsed on the title contingency, and Gary Pruitt's own partners turned and sued him, not the other way around, for the earnest money and the costs of a deal he had promised on land that was never his to sell. The association's lawsuit against me was dismissed the moment the court understood my lodge sat outside their plat, and the county notified the association that its gatehouse had been operating in violation of a recorded public easement and would have to be modified to permit unrestricted passage on the historic road. Diane Pruitt resigned the presidency she had held for 9 years before the next regular meeting. She lost specifically the things she had tried to take. She had wanted my road and my land for her husband's resort. She lost the resort, the water, and the gate. I did not gloat. There was nothing to gloat about. A woman with a clipboard had spent 3 years building a case, and every page of it had been a page against herself. The spring after, Lena drove up with her kids, and they did not stop at any gate, because there was no longer a gate that could stop them, and they sat in the aspen grove for a long afternoon near Carol's birthday. Mara graduated that May with her degree in environmental policy, and she came home for the summer and framed the 1911 easement, the old surveyor's copy Bud had given her, and she hung it in the lodge stairwell where the morning light hits it. Not as a trophy, she said when I asked, as a reminder of how her father kept a promise without ever once raising his voice. The lodge has good bones and a stubborn owner. Carol was right about both. So here is the lesson, plainly. because you came this far and you deserve it. Said out loud. If someone with a title and a clipboard tells you that your land is functionally theirs, do not argue with them on the gravel. Go to the county. Order the full chain of title on your property and on every parcel that touches your water and your road. Read the deed against the ground, walk the lines yourself, find out who really owns the spring, the easement, the access, because the person who controls those things controls the property, no matter whose name is on the biggest house in the valley. Keep a folder, date every notice, photograph every fine. Pay nothing you do not owe, and record everything you do. Authority that never checks its own facts cannot survive a public room and a clean record. You have to be right, and you have to be able to prove it. If you have a story like this, an HOA or a board or an office that decided your property was theirs to manage, put it in the comments. I read them. If this story was worth your evening, subscribe so the next one finds you. Chat. And next time I will tell you about the rancher whose HOA tried to condemn his stock pond as a community water feature, never knowing he held the senior water right on the whole creek. Take care of your land. Keep your folder. I will see you on the next one.